My focus today is going to be science fiction and fantasy. Um, the question is really a political question. Does science fiction, does fantasy literature, does it allow for social change? What is the cultural impact of reading science fiction? What is the cultural impact of being obsessed with The Lord of the Rings? Um, so let's begin here. What is the single largest obstacle to change? Think about it for a moment. Pause the screen recording if you have to. The single biggest obstacle to change is simply this: believing that the world we live in right now is the only possible world. That the world we live in is God given, that it's built upon God, or that the world we live in is built upon biology or nature. The way it works is this: if you believe that God exists and that God exists perpetually and permanently, then that means that the society that he talks about in the Bible or the Quran, whatever book, is also going to exist permanently and perpetually. God becomes a kind of permanent foundation for everything built upon him or her or it, or however you want to gender God. Same thing goes with nature. We believe, or some people believe, and people really used to believe this 100 plus years ago, that the way men and women are in society is entirely about biology. Women are smaller, so therefore they should be at home with the children. Men are larger and they're powerful, therefore they should be out in the world confronting challenging dangers, right? Now, here's the thing. Um, Obviously, the world has changed. Women, uh, I mean, part of the difference is the jobs that we do today are not dangerous. They don't require strong bodies. I mean, a woman in the military can push a button that will launch a nuclear weapon. It doesn't take a man to launch nuclear weapons, right? So the problem is most of us think that the world around us is in fact permanent, perpetual. Not that we think, oh, there's God or there's biology, but at the end of the day, when people have these discussions, they talk about biology, they talk about God. Society should be this way because God said so in the Quran, or God said so in the Hebrew Bible. If you want to change things, you have to begin by recognizing that society is in fact changeable, and that means it's artificial. If it's not artificial and it truly is God given and natural, then there's a lot less wiggle room. So let's get rid of this and let's talk about realistic fiction. Realistic fiction is fiction that attempts to show us the world as it really is. The classic definition is that realistic fiction is fiction that holds up a mirror to the world. If you're reading books that are showing you exactly the world you live in, is that going to create social change in your mind, or is that going to stop it? If you spend all your time watching things and reading things and looking at things that just say that's who you are and that's how things are, you're not going to change. Realism shows us what we already know, and as a result bolsters our opinions about the known world. It is not science fiction. It is not myth. It just reinforces and stabilizes what we already believe to be the naturalized, normal world we live in. Now, science fiction, on the other hand, is the literature of cognitive estrangement. Don't get lost here. Cognitive simply means mental. It is the literature of mental estrangement. Estrangement simply means making strange. The root word is strange. Darko Suvin is saying science fiction is involved in making us look at something with our minds and making it strange. We're looking at society and we're making it strange. We're rethinking it as a result. That which we took for granted, that which we took to be natural, now we see it in a new light. That's what science fiction does. A representation, this is a quote from Darko Suvin, his very famous book, This is the essay I'm drawing from, Estrangement into Cognition. It's on the Strange Horizons website. Okay, so science fiction is a representation, don't get lost there. A representation could be a picture, a story, a film, which estranges. A representation which estranges is one which allows us to recognize its subject, but at the same time makes it seem unfamiliar. So you look at a woman that you've seen a million times, or a man that you've seen a million times. You look at it, you recognize it, but let's say there's something different about it. Maybe there's been a haircut. Maybe the eyebrows have been cut off or something, or shaved off. You're looking at something you've seen a million times and never thought about, but somehow you see it and it's different and it causes you to think, right? Science fiction tends to, by showing us new worlds. Now, all right, so I just gave you an example of seeing someone, but what science fiction does is it shows you new worlds. It shows us Mars. It shows us, an apocalyptic world maybe in 2215, right? On the Earth, right? Science fiction is always showing us new worlds, new places, right? Um, and by doing that, it implies that every world is constructed and open to reconstruction. Let's focus on this for a minute. Um, Here's how I explained this recently. If someone came up to you, if Mary and Scott were married, if Mary came up to you, and she's a friend, and so is Scott, and Mary came up to you and said, I'm divorcing Scott because he did the following, you would believe her, right? The truth, which is her world, you would believe because she told you this. Let's say Scott came up to you. He would tell you a story about the same events, but he tells you the story about the same events and gives you a whole different number of reasons, a different rationale for why the divorce happened. He says that he divorced her. So you've heard this story and you've heard this story. They're about the same events, but they're told in a very different way. What does that do to you? If you just heard one set of events, you would believe it. It would be the truth with a capital T. But now you've seen two different sets of events. And what does that do? It makes you ponder both stories. It's the same thing in science fiction. Science fiction shows us, we know the world we live in, right? So we already see that. Science fiction shows us another world. All right, world one is Mary. World two is Scott. Science fiction shows us Scott, right? And what we do when we're reading about Scott's story is we compare it to the story that we live in, the real world, Mary's world, right? The world that we live in. And it forces us to look at both worlds as artificial and constructed. Because if the world we're looking at in the world of Avatar, right, if that's a possible way that societies can function, well, that means that maybe the world I live in here in the United States and Northwest Ohio can be reconstructed and remodeled in light of that one, or vice versa. Maybe Avatar needs something from the world of the Earth. Science fiction shows us other worlds, and the goal is that we tinker with our own and we improve our own, and we do it endlessly because we've not arrived. People are oppressed. People are in it. There's inequality. There's injustice. So what science fiction, and this is a kind of a Marxist argument behind this, I think. What science fiction does is it makes us rethink the world we live in so that we can change it, and keep on changing it endlessly to improve it. Never resting, never being happy, because there's always something else that can be done to improve the world for humans and nature, right? Now, how is myth, and myth and fantasy are kind of the same thing in this world. How does myth change? How does myth operate differently? Myth shows us another world. In The Lord of the Rings, we're shown a different world, right? But then, at the end of the day, myth argues for permanence. There's something permanent. In the world of Tolkien, the world of The Lord of the Rings, there is a spiritual foundation behind it all. And if there's some kind of foundation or some kind of permanence, that means, unlike in the world of science fiction, that we can stop. We simply model our world over what we see in the world of The Lord of the Rings, the positive stuff, not the negative stuff. And guess what? Our society is fixed. Science fiction, or the Marxist kind of behind this theory, would argue that it's never finished, and that thinking that you're done, that your society is permanently fixed, is going to end up causing oppression, and eventually. Okay. All right, this slide I more or less talked you through. Here's an example. Here's Samwise in Lord of the Rings. He's climbing up Mount Doom and he sees a white star twinkle. The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. This is that moment. In fact, it might be the only moment in that 1,200 pages where we see something permanent, untouchable behind it all. It's a spiritual moment. Sam realizes that the world he lives in is crappy, but behind it all, there's something that's permanent and perpetual that Sauron and Saruman cannot touch. This is a mythical moment, and this is what fantasy does. It shows us another world, but behind that other world, there's a permanence. And the goal is, the implication is, all we have to do here in the reader's world is change our world to mirror that permanent, positive foundation, and things will be fine. Science fiction, there's never a permanent foundation. There's always searching for something new. So I'm going to move a little bit quickly here because there's not much time left. Briefly, here's an example from Darko Suvin. This is Darko Suvin 1.3. And he's talking about, Brecht is writing here, Bertolt Brecht is talking about, I quoted this already, he's talking about Galileo, who, and giving us an example of what a strange but looks like. Galileo, the great scientist, looks at a swinging chandelier and he says, and he thinks to himself, my God, why is that chandelier swinging? Think about this. Most of us have seen 1,000,000 chandeliers, maybe not 1,000,000 chandeliers. We've seen lights swing, have we not? How many of us pause and say, why is that happening? How many of us pause and ask, why are these trees outside my office window blowing? Why are they moving around? The answer can't be simply wind, right, for a scientist. The question is, the example is trying to get at this. Most of us look at the world and we don't think about it. We're so used to it. Galileo sees this chandelier swinging, and he's like a child, and he's thinking, why is it happening? He's a child with huge intellect. He sees the world again. He recognizes it, but sees the world again as if for the very first time, and it allows him this breathtaking insight. It allows him this creative insight. And this is where science and art meet. If you want to do something new, if you want to create some new idea, if you want to create some new piece of art, if you want to do great science, you can't take things for granted. You have to look at the world as if for the very first time and think about it in a brand new, if you will, childlike manner. Get outside of normality, get outside of what is naturalized, and look at things askew. Now, 2.1, also a quote, there should be quotation marks here, is also, this is a bit about comparing myth with science fiction. He says that estrangement is also in myth or fantasy. However, myth is timeless and it's religious. So whereas science fiction sees things as endlessly changeable, myth is diametrically opposed to the cognitive approach since it conceives of human relationships as fixed and supernaturally determined. At the end of the day, what he's saying is behind myth and fantasy, there is an underlying order in which God believes that certain relationships, that society is fixed by God. Myth and fantasy, in an underlying way, on an underlying level, believe that society is fixed. Men and women should be relating to each other in a fixed, supernaturally determined, ordained way. So, science fiction allows us to reflect and recreate. We see something for the first time in a new way, and as a result, we reflect about it. And because we're thinking about this, it allows us to change things or create new things here in the society we live in. Science fiction believes the world is artificial, and that means not fated, not static, but changeable. Myth, at the end of the day, believes in some kind of underlying order, so it's going to be more conservative in this case meaning averse to change. Myth and fantasy believes in an underlying order, and that means that change, which should be progressive, though it isn't always, change will stop. It's like science fiction wants to poke holes in the box that we live in and always stretch us outside of the box, which is our boundaries and which is our identity. Myth wants to poke a hole in that box and show us a larger box. And that larger box has firm boundaries, and we will never get outside of those boundaries. Okay, so that's enough for today. If you have any questions, let me know. Send me an email, and thank you for listening.